Crossroads, we talk about changing the world, and it's very rarely that I actually get to be with somebody who right now is changing the world in ways that are being understood by the masses. It's an honor to be here in Montgomery, Alabama with, I'd like to say a new friend, but I couldn't say it just in 10 minutes, but Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is really, really, really an honor. Most of us, or many of us, may not know you or your story. Just tell us about who you are. What's your story?
Sure. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I'm a lawyer, and over the last 35 years, I've represented the poor, the accused, the condemned on death row. I fought for children prosecuted as adults, the wrongly convicted, the unfairly sentenced. And I believe that there's a justice deficit in our communities, in our nation. And so we've been trying to correct that. And I come from a faith perspective that believes that we are required to do justice, and that's more than something you say, it's something that you actually do. I think when the prophet Micah said, do justice, he meant that we should be actively trying to increase justice where we see injustice, eradicate inequality. I believe in loving mercy, and that means being compassionate and looking beyond the challenges that we see. And then I believe, as the prophet says, that we should walk humbly with God, and that has shaped my journey, that has brought me here to Montgomery, Alabama, where for the last 30 years, the Equal Justice Initiative has been trying to provide services to the poor. And we've been creating spaces to help the nation begin to reckon with the history of racial inequality.
Now, this is all great. This is all great. Fantastic, Bryan, but come on. You're not saying the most important stuff. That you actually look like Michael B. Jordan. I mean, are you serious? How does it feel that Michael B. Jordan looks like you and they chose him to be you in a movie called Just Mercy?
Well, they didn't straight up say because he looks like you were going to get him to be you. But what's funny was when he came, we spent a lot of time together, and he was so committed to getting everything exactly right. He wanted to be as authentic as possible, and he would say, well, how do you move in court, and how do you do this? And he would watch me and all these kinds of things, and he was just so committed to being authentic and getting it right. And there was a moment when I did have to tell him, I want you to be authentic, I want you to get it right. But when it comes to like the physique, you can keep the Black Panther body when you play me. I don't need you to get that exactly right. I was really honored to have him play me in the film, and I thought he did a brilliant job, as did the whole cast. And it's been great to see the story of some of my work presented in that format.
How true to life was that story? This movie was really a fantastic story. I'll just ask you some things, and you can expound on it or say true, not true. Had a promising career coming out of Harvard.
True.
Did downward mobility by getting into an area of law that wouldn't pay you as well as you could have been paid.
Yeah, and I didn't ever think of it as downward. I just said, I got to follow my heart and go where I believe I'm called to go, and ended up with the condemned on death row. It never felt like it was a sacrifice. It never felt like it was doing something that was difficult. It was challenging, but I just felt called to be in those spaces.
You represented a man who had been unjustly convicted, was going to die, and you literally saved his life. True?
Yes, that's true.
So take us there. That's what the movie is about.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating. I find, even talking about these things, sometimes I feel like the fact that I'm interested, or I say fascinating, sometimes it demeans the underlying situation that's happening here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reality is that we've changed a lot in this country. We went from a prison population of about 200,000 in the 1970s to a prison population of over 2.2 million. And that focus on punishment and conviction meant that we put a lot of people in jails and prisons who were wrongly convicted, who were innocent. I think we have a criminal legal system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. I don't think culpability shapes outcomes as much as wealth. And so Walter McMillan was one of the poor who was innocent, wrongly convicted, and then sentenced to death in a community that is the same community where Harper Lee grew up and wrote the story To Kill a Mockingbird. And most people know that story, and they romanticize that story. They celebrate that story. They do that even in the county where he lives. They just couldn't connect the story to the current manifestations of inequality, of unfairness. And even though he was at his home with 40 other people raising money for his sister's church when a crime took place, he was wrongly accused. He was having an affair with a young white woman that got him in the attention to some of the law enforcement people. They put him on death row for 15 months before the trial to create an identity of guilt. The papers would say death row defendant Walter McMillan will be tried next week. And then he was convicted in a trial that lasted less than a day and a half. The jury actually sentenced him to life without parole, but the trial judge overrode the jury's verdict and imposed the death penalty. And I met him on death row with dozens of other people who had been unfairly convicted and sentenced, and he was literally dying for legal assistance. We don't provide lawyers to people, even under sentence of death in this country. After your trial and your initial appeal, you don't have a right to counsel. And so we started fighting for Mr. McMillan, and I met his family, because I don't think you can actually be an effective advocate if you don't understand the whole story, if you don't understand the forces that push people into these places. And I just saw a lot of the problems that I continue to see, where some people are marginalized, some people are neglected, some people are abused, some people are ignored, and their lives are diminished by our indifference to their suffering. And we fought and fought and fought, and ultimately came up with such dramatic evidence of his innocence that they acknowledged that he was wrongly convicted, and I was able to walk out of death row with him by my side, and it was beautiful. It was affirming. We walked out for death row. He started waving his arms like this, and I'd never heard him sing. He'd never sung when we were together on the road. But when we started doing this, he started singing that song, "I'll Fly Away." Oh. And it was, for me, really affirming. And I've had the privilege of doing that on multiple occasions, and that's what really energizes me.
Yeah, that movie was just really powerful, and knowing that it's not based on reality, it is reality.
Absolutely.
It is reality. It's really powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it was important to me that they present some of the other people I've represented, and in the film, they tell the story of one of my other clients, a man named Herbert Richardson, who was a Vietnam vet, who was really traumatized by his time in battle, and he ended up killing someone, and he was responsible for the death of a young person in his community, but he was severely mentally ill. And his story is presented in the film as well, because for me it was important to make sure that people understand that I don't just represent people who are innocent. For me, I'm persuaded that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. My time, my faith has persuaded me that if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And I think God requires that we understand the other things you are before we judge you. And I wanted Herbert's story to be part of the film so people could begin to struggle with this more complicated question of how do we judge one another? How do we think about one another? I got involved into this work because I went to death row and met people who sang to me about trying to get to higher ground. I met people who had this deep and abiding faith and conviction. I met people whose just capacity and spirituality just jumped out at me. And when I left death row for the first time, driving back, I thought about Saul, the offender, Saul, the felon, Saul, the formerly incarcerated, and what would have happened if he lived at a time where they executed the Sauls of this world before they could become the Apostle Paul. And I just felt this burden to represent those who had not yet come into the fullness of what it means to be redeemed and restored. And that still animates my work today.
Well, you make a really strong point about not being categorized for something you've done.
Yeah.
None of us who have not told the truth on our income taxes would like to be known as the cheater.
That's right.
None of us who have used pornography would like to be known as the masturbator.
Exactly.
Right? But so while I could totally say that's really good, help me understand, like, I get paranoid sometimes that different people are using different words to mean different things. Mm-hmm. Help us out here. Help me out here. What for you is, you mentioned fairness. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between fairness, between justice, and between mercy?
Yeah.
How do those look? Because sometimes, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm white. I don't know. I maybe you're one of the people who doesn't see color, but I am white. And a lot of white people, when they hear calls for justice, it sounds like just let people get off with things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think you believe that.
No.
How does those things all fit together?
I think we have this sense that when you do wrong, you should be held accountable, and when you do right, there should be some affirmation of that. I mean, at its core, that's what we're trying to get to. We have people that make mistakes. We have people that fall down. But if we react too harshly, then it becomes unjust. In the 1970s, we said that people who are dealing with drug addiction and drug dependency are criminals. And that's the moment when we declared this misguided war on drugs and we started putting hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons because of addiction and dependency. I don't think that was fair because I believe addiction and dependency is a health problem and we need a healthcare response. We've gotten acculturated in America so that when someone says, I'm an alcoholic, we don't think that they should be in prison. If we see them going to a bar, we don't call the police. We worry about them, but we understand the nature of that. And what's happened when you live in a society that gets governed by fear and anger, you start tolerating things and accepting things that you know are unfair, putting children in adult prison. So we have 13 states with no minimum age of trying a child as an adult. So I sometimes represent 9-year-old kids who are facing 50 and 60-year prison sentences in adult prisons. I've held 13-year-old children who've been placed in adult jails where they were beaten and sexually assaulted and tormented. And I know that most people, everybody who could be in that space with me would see the unfairness of that. The justice question comes when the question is posed, what do we do about that? Do we separate ourselves? Do we isolate ourselves? Do we look away? Or are we compelled to do something? And that's why, for me, there is an urgency in this country to do something about the over-incarceration that has condemned so many. We've got 70 million Americans with criminal arrest histories, which means that when they try to get jobs or try to get loans, they're disfavored. We've got nearly 5 million people on probation or parole. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We don't seem to be bothered by that. And so the justice part is making sure that we are actually reflecting our basic values. We don't put crimes in jails and prisons. You can't put a crime in jail or prison. You put a person in jail or prison. And if you believe, as I believe, that people are not crimes, then you have to kind of give a little more thought to how we think about what's an acceptable punishment, what's a just punishment. And mercy, for me, is the important part of it, because mercy is what we give, what we show to others who don't deserve it. Mercy is not for the deserving. It's for the undeserving. It's the way we reinforce what it means to be persuaded that there's grace, that there's compassion, that love has a power to restore and redeem. And I just think in too many places we've moved away from that. We've allowed fear and anger to cause us to believe things that are ultimately leading to oppression and unfairness, excess and abuse. And I see a lot of that in the spaces where I go.
One of my early tickets that I had for speeding, I was on the edge of losing my license because I had too many points. So I represented myself in court. My one time where I was an attorney, I was a lawyer, and the guy says, the judge says, how do you plead? And I said, I plead guilty. And he looked at me like, I said, Your Honor, I understand that this court has the ability to give mercy. And I admit that I was speeding. And I also know if you feel so inclined, you can choose to not let me have any points and let me off without a fine. And that's what I'm asking for today, humbly.
Yeah.
He gave me the fine, but he waived the points, so I didn't have to have the thing. So what is justice? Because it does seem like when we talk about justice versus we talk about mercy based on how we feel. We're just letting somebody off.
No,
what is it?
I think what we're inviting people to do is to actually acknowledge the wrong they've done, with an understanding that through acknowledgement there are these possibilities that open up for restoration, redemption. And I actually do believe that when we begin to accept responsibility, we actually begin to recognize why what we've done isn't something we should continue to do. If we don't accept responsibility, then you have to worry that people are going to continue to do the things they shouldn't do over and over again. And we ought to be inviting people to say, I plead guilty. But when you create a system that will crush you, if you were told pleading guilty means you'll never drive again, if you were told that you were going to go to prison for the rest of your life if you plead guilty, you actually undermine the healthier instinct which we're trying to cultivate, which is to have people accept responsibility, to embrace the wrongfulness of what they've done so that they can get to a better place. And an unjust system makes that harder rather than making that easier, which is why having appropriate punishment becomes a priority. Having just sentencers become a priority. If the judge is going to look at you as more dangerous, more guilty, less worthy of a mitigated sentence because of your race or your gender or your ethnicity, then that's not going to be a fair process. That's not going to be a just process. And we have a lot of those issues as well.
Yeah, so just part of justice has to be this situation and this situation, if they're apples to apples, they both should have the same sentence. That's not happening in our country. Just go ahead and go down the examples or laundry list of how injustice is happening in our country.
Well, I mean, the disparities are really profound. 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison sometime during his lifetime, according to the Bureau of Justice. That's not because the rates of offending are that much greater, but I believe there's a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that we assign to certain people. And that presumption then makes it really easy for people to be wrongly convicted, wrongly accused, unfairly sentenced. If you're a black person, black man, you're 6 times more likely to go to prison for the same crime committed by a white person.
For the same crime, apples to apples, 6x more.
The death penalty has dramatic evidence of this. You're 22 times more likely to get sentenced to death if you're a black defendant convicted of killing a white person. Race of the victim is the greatest predictor of who ends up on death row. And these presumptions manifest themselves in all kinds of ways. So, I mean, I'm a lawyer, I went to Harvard, got all these degrees and all that stuff. And I still have to navigate presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. I argued a case at the US Supreme Court, which we won, that granted relief to a lot of kids. So I was going around the country doing these hearings. And I was in the Midwest to do a hearing, had my suit and tie on, got to court early, was sitting at defense counsel's table. And the judge walked in and he saw me sitting there and he got angry. He said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I had to stand up and apologize. I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing and the prosecutor started laughing. And I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client, who was more vulnerable than I was. Client came in, we did the hearing, but afterward I was sitting in my car thinking, I'm a middle-aged black man with all of these degrees, and I'm still required to laugh at my own humiliation to defend my clients. And what pains me at this moment is that you can be a pastor, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be an engineer, you can be loving, you can be kind, but if you're black or brown, you go places in this country where you are required to navigate these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. And for a lot of us, and I can speak to this because I'm getting older, it's exhausting. You get tired of being presumed dangerous and guilty. You get tired of having to bear the burden of incompetency and of wrongfulness. And that is why we need to lift up justice. We need to lift this veil that contaminates our ability to be one with one another in the way that we're supposed to be.
I understand how justice could make that go away. But where I always get caught up, I was just having a conversation with some staff members about this just the other day, is I always get short circuit on, okay, but what can we actually do?
Yeah.
What can happen? We can talk about the injustices. It's awful that you have a worse experience in America when you're more qualified in everything. I've never been to Harvard. I don't know if you know that. Right? I've never been to Harvard, never desired to be in Harvard. I think I could probably spell Harvard, okay? And yet, as being less qualified in terms of smarts and academics and everything, my life is going to be much easier than yours because I've never had a bad interaction with an authority figure simply because of my skin. You have, and you do regularly. What do we do about, what do I do about that?
Yeah, I think there are four things I can recommend. I think we have to commit to getting closer to people who are experiencing inequality and injustice. We can't separate ourselves from those who are marginalized and excluded and abused. We actually have to be in fellowship with them, because when you're proximate, you hear things you won't otherwise hear, you see things you won't others see, and you actually take on the burdens of the excluded and the disfavored. They become your burdens, and it changes your comfort level, your space in that society. The second thing is that I actually think we have to believe things we haven't seen about what we can achieve to create a more just community. If we accept that these things are just inevitable, that we'll never get to anything better, we won't actually be motivated to do the things we have to do. And then I think we have to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient, because there is no pathway to justice that doesn't require some discomfort and some inconvenience. And finally, we have to reflect on our own complicity in the world that's been created that advantages us and disadvantages others. You know, in the Gospels, in John, in the 8th chapter, the story that's presented is the Pharisees coming to Jesus with a woman caught in adultery. And they emphasize that she was caught in the very act. There's no question about her culpability. And then they say the law of Moses says is that we condemn her, that we cast stones and we stone her to death. And Jesus kind of looks away and he gives them time. And then he finally says, let him of you who is without sin cast the first stone. And they're convicted by that. He doesn't say adultery is okay. He doesn't actually focus on her. He focuses on them. And we need to focus on ourselves and recognize that we have shortcomings, deficits that can contribute to the environment that allows this to persist. And I think that story, that parable, is a powerful parable for a country that is reckoning with how to be more just, how to be more mindful of what justice requires at a time when there's a lot of failure.
You mentioned being, for me, being complicitous. What does that mean? That means stuff has happened, I'm white, I should feel guilty about that. What does that mean?
No, it just means that we live in an environment where our history of racial injustice has kind of created these pollutants. They're just in the air. We've all been contaminated by a long history of racial bias, narratives of racial difference. We inherited that. And a lot of us have been taught that we can just ignore that. We can be silent about that. And some people have argued that eventually these toxins will dissipate from the atmosphere. When I don't think that's true. These kinds of contaminants are the kinds of things that we have to actually work to deal with. We have to correct them. And for me, racism is a sin. White supremacy is a sin. An ideology that insists on racial hierarchy is a sin. A belief system that says that Black people aren't as good as white people is a sin. When we begin to persuade ourselves that Black people are less deserving, less capable, less worthy, less human, we actually are sinning about what we understand to be our calling as human beings. And so we have to now work to overcome and confront the things that have been embraced around us that have perpetuated that. And that means just ending the silence. I don't think it's guilt. I actually just think it's reckoning, and I actually think the church has a critical role to play in this, because we're supposed to understand something about how to help people who have fallen down, who've been misdirected by sin and misjudgment. And what we offer people is redemption and restoration and salvation. And the reason why I'm so interested in pushing our country to acknowledge that we're a post-genocide society, I think what happened to indigenous people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of native people, and we've never really acknowledged that. We said those native people are savages, and we created this narrative of racial difference to justify that violence. And that narrative of racial difference is what got us comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery. And I don't think the great evil of American slavery was the forced labor or the involuntary servitude. The true evil of slavery was this idea that Black people are not as good as white people. And that ideology of white supremacy, we never acknowledged. We passed the 13th Amendment that talks about ending involuntary servitude, but it doesn't talk about ending that ideology. And that gave rise to a century of lynching and terrorism and segregation. And we were silent. The church was silent. I was born at a time when Black children couldn't go to the public schools.
Right.
I started my education in a colored school, and nobody was really saying much about that. And so when I talk about complicity, what I'm talking about is ending the silence. And in the church, we understand that if you come and you want redemption and salvation, you can't just claim those things. Yeah. There's got to be repentance. There's got to be confession. And we should embrace it, because that opens up the door to restoration and reconciliation. And that's what we're offering people. And I don't talk about these things like lynching and segregation and slavery because I want to punish America. I want liberation. Yeah. I believe there's something better waiting for us all across this country, something that feels more like freedom, feels more like justice, feels more like equality. It's waiting for us. But to get there, we have to have the courage of our convictions to end the silence, to learn the things we need to understand, to talk about the things we need to talk about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I just curious how you react to this. A lot of it isn't a race thing or a white-black thing. A lot of it is a human thing. Mm-hmm. Humans in every corner of the globe, in every segment of history, has had have had groups against each other, right? That was the World War II. The Japanese believed that they were a superior race, and that's why they could do what they did when all the genocide happened of Native Americans. Those folks were killing and crushing and wiping them out long before we came in. I just read a book on the Comanches. Just my goodness. Yeah. So it's really a sin problem that humans have, and some of us who are in a place in culture where we have more power and authority, i.e. white like me, historically in America, have the ability to wield that authority in unjust ways. Agree, disagree? How would you put that?
I don't. Yeah, absolutely. It's a human thing. You can go all around the world and you'll see manifestations of this problem. You see a group with power othering people with less power and using that difference in power. Othering. Yeah, and it can be based on ethnicity. It can be based on tribes. You had a genocide in Rwanda that wasn't about color. It was about tribal affiliation. It can be based on religion. It can be based on whether you're an immigrant or not an immigrant. So it can manifest itself everywhere. But we shouldn't allow that to distract us from the fact in America that we have been shaped around a very specific divide shaped by race. 41 states in this country until the 1960s had laws that prohibited a white person from being in a romantic relationship with a black person. That's during the 20th century. Most of us were born at a time when that wasn't allowed. We did not allow people who were black to go to school with people who were whites. We were shaped into thinking about the world through that color lens. And so that is the challenge that we have to confront here. But you're right, it is a universal human problem. And there'll be new challenges if we're not careful. Yeah. If we allow ourselves to be persuaded that people who are immigrants are somehow more dangerous, less worthy, less capable, then we're going to see that kind of bias. People who have a different faith than we do, people who are from the Mideast, people who are Muslim, people who are in different spaces. And that's why we have to understand that we are called to love all of God's children. And that for me is where it all boils down to. And if we understand our capacity to love to be disrupted by bias, that's something we've got to work on.
How do you love people who are making life difficult for you? You were just sharing with me before we started rolling the cameras about just some of the odd holidays. Just because I'd be really angry and unloving if I were you. Just fill us in on those things. It's like crazy.
It is challenging. I mean, here in Alabama, I moved here in the 80s. We have 59 markers and memorials to celebrate the defenders of slavery, the architects of enslavement, those who fought to preserve white supremacy are celebrated in this state. Jefferson Davis's birthday is still a state holiday. Confederate Memorial Day is still a state holiday. We don't have Martin Luther King Day. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. There are monuments and memorials everywhere, and everybody's resistant to acknowledging the history of slavery. And it is challenging to be targeted and menaced. When I was representing Walter McMillan, a man in the Just Mercy film, I got so many death threats. I got so many bomb threats. And I remember calling my brother and saying, I don't understand why people want to kill me. I'm trying to help make our system more justice, but people were threatened by that kind of activism. But I believe we are called to love. And I'm inspired that because in this city, Montgomery, there's a rich tradition of that. The generation that came before me, Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Johnny Carr and Joanne Robinson, these were people, because of their faith, that would put on their Sunday best and they would go places to ask this country to own up to its rights, to its legacy, to its commitment to equal treatment. And they'd get down on their knees and they'd pray. And while they were praying, they would get beaten and battered and bloodied and spat upon. And yet they went anyway. And it wasn't just that they wanted their rights. It was because they understood that the love of God compels us to break down the yoke of bondage that is created by bigotry and discrimination. And I have to sometimes see through all of that animosity, all of that hatred. And I want people to get to a better place. Even the people who are hateful toward me, even the people who call me all kinds of names. I don't want anybody to die with the blindness created by racism and bigotry. I just feel bad for people. And even though they can create more problems for me than I can create for them because of these power differentials, it doesn't mean that I have any doubt about the power of truth to resurrect, the power of truth to liberate. Yeah. And ultimately, you become committed to truth-telling when you understand what it can do and mean, not just for yourself, but for the community of people around you.
Can I let you be my consultant?
Okay.
Could you? I really mean this. I totally mean this. So, what would you do if you were me? Let's say you're leading a rather large church that has campuses in more than one state, and you have people who are all across the spectrum in terms of their political affiliation and their skin tones. What would you do if you were me? Because I feel like no matter what happens, I can't win. I cannot win.
Well, I actually think we have to.
And I do mean not only like give me a defense, like what would you do in terms of the energy of the church? What would you do with how often you talk about something? Your budget, like what would that be?
I would begin by preaching from Micah 6 and 8 about how we can't really claim to be God's children. We can't actually claim to be honoring the faith.
Oh yeah, Micah 6:8. I was just memorizing that earlier. So good. Yeah. Well, maybe you want to remind me exactly.
Yes,
Micah
exactly.
6.
So in Micah 6:8, the prophet is asked, well, what does God want from us? What kind of offerings do we need to make to have the favor of God? And Micah responds that what God requires of us is not any of the burnt offerings, not giving away your first child, not all of that ornate stuff, not coming to church every Sunday, not wearing the best clothes, not having the most to tithe. What God requires of us is that we do justice, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly with him. And I believe that we haven't preached on, we haven't taught on, we haven't thought about what doing justice requires. And in a nation where some people are disfavored and marginalized and excluded and treated unfairly because of their color, doing justice means that we have to speak about that. If unarmed Black people are being shot by the police in ways that are just absolutely unacceptable, we have to speak about that. If there are disparities based on how people are treating, based on their color, we have to talk about that. And we have to talk about it from a place of love. I think when we talk and lead, we have to invite people to learn because we haven't learned the things we need to understand. We have a calendar at EJI, and I invite people to kind of just sign up for it. Each day we put out something about our history of racial injustice. And when you learn about the things we've done, it changes your perspective about the things we now need to do. And that learning is an opportunity to get us closer to how we remedy. We live in a broken society. We live in a broken world. We see broken communities. And if we're committed to healing, we have to figure out what do we need to do to get to repair. And you can't understand what that requires until you understand the nature of the damage, until you understand the nature of the injury, until you can assess what happened to figure out where the problems are. And we haven't done that. We don't actually go into poor and minority communities to get a sense of the challenges that are faced. We don't talk about the children that are born into violent families, living in violent neighborhoods who have trauma disorders by the time they're 5. We don't reflect about what it's like to be in the margins and to be disfavored all the time. And so we have to do that. And then I think we have to own up to the mistakes we've made. In this region, the faith community not only was complicit, they were supporting segregation forever. They actually believed that their goal of racial separateness was more important than the commitment, the command to love one another. And I think we need to acknowledge the wrongfulness of that. Just like we've evolved when it comes to thinking about sexual conduct in the workplace, we've evolved in our thinking about issues like domestic violence. 50 years ago, we didn't actually protect women who were being abused in the household the way we do now. We had to learn some things about the horror of that. We didn't actually require people who drive while intoxicated to stop driving until Mothers Against Drunk Driving brought us closer to the pain and suffering created by allowing people to get in cars after they're intoxicated and the damage that did. And our attitude shifted. And that attitude shift has gotten us to a better place where we have to engage in some narrative work. You know, in Germany, it's fascinating. You go to Berlin, Germany, you see markers and stones placed next to the homes of Jewish families all over that community. In Berlin, the cab drivers and the hotel operators invite you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. You can't go anywhere in Berlin without seeing some reckoning with the Holocaust. And there are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. It'd be unconscionable there to say, let's celebrate the architects and defenders of the Holocaust. And that reckoning has given rise to an openness. And I wouldn't go to Germany if there were Adolf Hitler statues everywhere, if they weren't owning up to the Holocaust. But in this country, I live in a region surrounded by the iconography of the Confederacy, where if you talk about race, people get nervous, get angry.
Right.
If you talk about racial justice, they look for exits. And we have to change that. And we have to change it in a spirit of love that says we can get to something better.
It's just odd any way you look at it, right? And not just are those statutes and Jefferson Davis Day, which is news to me until I came here. Oh my goodness. Not only is that just really odd, but like we were really justifiably upset about the insurgency that happened in the Capitol.
Yeah.
These are names that tried to take down the United States of America.
Yeah.
These are names that were split. So aside from racial stuff, why we would celebrate, you try to take down the United States of America is crazy.
It is crazy unless you see it in service of a kind of order that demands that. And that's the problem, right? Because even after that period of time, you know, for 100 years, we allowed mobs to pull Black people out of their homes and beat them and drown them and torture them and lynch them, sometimes on the courthouse lawn, in front of churches. People were tortured, they were burned to death, and people would bring their children as if somehow this was a cultural ritual, and we did these destructive things. It was terrorism that we tolerated. Our courts didn't do anything, law enforcement didn't do anything, Congress didn't do anything, and it traumatized a whole population. 6 million Black people left the American South and went to places like Cincinnati and Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles, not as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities, but they went to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South during my lifetime.
Yeah.
And we just tolerated it. We weren't required. The difference between America and Germany in one respect is that the Germans lost the war. Power shifted. In South Africa, power shifted. Black South Africans got political power and things changed. Power hasn't shifted here, which means that our path to redemption, our path to restoration has to be rooted in a moral awakening, a spiritual awakening that recognizes the threat posed by bigotry and violence, by otherism, because we don't have the power change to facilitate that.
I hadn't thought about the drunk driving illustration related to the race stuff. That's really profound, Brian. I graduated high school in 1983. You know, all of us who drank and got wasted in high school, 82, 81, we were all driving and drunk all the time.
That's right.
I mean, all the time. I would pull into my parents' garage in my car in my parents' car, and sometimes just terrified because I would say, I don't remember leaving the field or the party, and I don't remember how I got here, but I'm here.
Yeah.
My friend, we were going 90 miles an hour in a Chevy Nova off on backcountry roads and went off the road, hit a tree, cops came, we were both just utterly tanked.
Yeah.
And like, okay, boys, let's get you home. Nothing.
Yeah.
So we went from that was obviously awful to where we are now, where universally, we all realize that's a really bad idea.
That's
and
right.
we all universally like, no, you shouldn't do that.
That's
God
right.
bless Uber or whatever's out there.
That's
It
right.
would be really fascinating if we could get there in terms of the race stuff, to where
Yeah.
I remember when,
Yeah.
I remember, and universally,
That's right.
we stopped trying to justify why I drove drunk when I was 16 or
Right.
actually even 15.
Right.
And just to see that migration, but it feels like we're stuck. Like we're still, why are we stuck?
I think part of it is that this is a longer term problem. I mean, this has been going on for 400 years. When the
Yeah.
first African people came here, we created these presumptions, and people have just been made comfortable with the way things are. And so when you tell them that things have to change, that's always challenging. But the good news is that we have made some progress. We have a lot more progress that has to be made. And the good news is that, we've created spaces where we can be together and learn from one another and talk to one another. And we begin to discover things about the beauty of the human community that we would not have been able to discover 50 years ago, when it wouldn't have been possible to be in that same place. Now with that knowledge, we just have to be passionate about getting to the better place, right? And I do think it's hard when you have power to not believe that power is completely justified, completely earned, completely appropriate, that there was nothing about the way you got your power and your status that was unearned. And I think what the Gospels teach us is that there is no such thing as justified power, earned power. We are all people who have benefited from God's grace.
Yeah.
And some of us have been more protected and more privileged than others. And when we truly understand the nature of God's grace and God's love, we understand that we're called to share the power and privilege that we've been given with others who have been denied it, to kind of make peace with the world around us. And that means addressing the inequality, addressing the injustice, addressing the bigotry and bias that we see. And we're just not required to do it. And so we have to be motivated to do it because we're human. We're biologically and psychologically programmed to do what's comfortable. We like comfort. That's just true for every human being, which means that we actually have to make a choice to do uncomfortable things. We actually have to decide that's what we're going to do. And we won't decide to do it if it's not in our self-interest based on money or based on status or based on power, unless we're persuaded that it is what we're required to do to be right with God, to be whole, to be healthy, to be fully human. And that's why I believe the church has such a critical role to play in leading in this time of conflict and division, in getting people to get past the fear and anger, get past the instinct to only do what's comfortable, and open up our hearts to that better thing waiting for us when we put down the shackles and constraints created by racism and bigotry and discrimination.
All right. Huh? Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just keep taking his time. I would, if you would, just do like quick lightning round questions. We're done.
Yeah.
At least I'm done. Unless there's something you really want me to ask him. This is phenomenal. Yeah. Yeah, I got that. Okay, and then we're done.
Okay?
This is great.
Thank you.
Let me just. All right. All right. All right, ready? All right, here we go.
Lightning round. Here we go.
All right, Bryan Stevenson, now's the time we come to a lightning round.
Okay.
The rules are, I give you topic, you answer like one or two sentences, like bang, 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 quick. As an attorney, can you do this quickly? Can you take the lightning round?
That's a challenge for me, but I'll try.
All right. Number one, justify why you spell your first name wrong. It's B-R-I-A-N, not B-R-Y-A-N.
I'm sure it was an accident of birth, and I just wasn't able to make the corrections that other people have been able to make.
All right. Two, do you have a man crush on Michael B. Jordan?
I have a man crush on anybody who can generate the kind of excitement that he does. You go in a room with him, the most dangerous place is between Michael Jordan and the hundreds of people running at him. So I've learned to step back from that. And so I do have admiration for that.
The most memorable thing about Harvard?
Wow. I got there and I realized I was a first-year law student and I'd never met a lawyer in my entire life. And it was just shocking to me to be around all of these folks who not only had met lawyers, but were the children of lawyers. That was the thing. I felt, oh my God, I am so unprepared for this space.
Finish this question. finish this sentence. At this point in my life, I'm really surprised that
I'm still really eager, enthusiastic, and excited to do what I do. And I feel really energized by the opportunities that are in front of me.
the difference between fairness and justice.
Fairness is what we know and understand to be right. It's like the difference between law and justice. The law can say this and say that, and the law can be unjust. Justice is a thing that integrates fairness with doctrine and what's required.
The reason why we don't give more mercy.
It's because we're afraid. It's because fear and anger will persuade you that it's not safe to be compassionate. It's not safe to be generous. It's not safe to offer grace. And we have to get past the fear and anger.
Bryan Stevenson, this has been fantastic, brother.
Thank you.
I mean, truly, brother. I came here wanting to interact with you on race and justice issues, having no real understanding of just kind of the deep spiritual well you drink from. And I've enjoyed every minute being with you. So thank you for pouring into us. Thank you for challenging us and encouraging us. It's been just a great time. Any final thing you want to give us today?
No, I'm just really encouraged that you're here. I appreciate your willingness to come to Montgomery. I want to invite others to come and spend time in our sites. And thank you for having a heart and a mind open to having these important conversations.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Terrific.
I'll probably just give one more question we can work in earlier if we want to. Yeah, if we can. We have time? Or I got to get out here to catch a plane. What time is it right now?
We got 12:03.
Oh, okay. I want to give you the ability to stump for your memorial in the museum. We didn't do that at all, and I want to stump him because there are a lot of people going to see this. And just do that one off. We can insert that in there if that's okay.
Let's roll through.
All right, here we go. All right.
Asking that question.
Great. You're the kind of guy that you just feel like a loser when you're around. Like, no one's making a movie of me. Like, I don't have interesting, fascinating articles about my life's work all over the place when I've never actually interacted with Oprah. I've never actually done a memorial. You created a memorial that when I heard about it, I saw a thing on TV about it years ago, and it came up. I was like, that's definitely something I would never want to go see because I'm generally a person who doesn't like to get depressed. I don't know if you know about that. I don't like to be depressed. I thought, okay, I'll put that on the list. The next time I want to get depressed, I'll go there. Yeah. Well, I was here in town. I went to the memorial. Didn't know before I got here, or I had forgotten from the special that I saw that you were the guy behind that memorial. Yeah. I actually came to the memorial not depressed, actually. I mean, it's an incredibly depressing situation in our country, but I actually was, what's the right word? Inspired sounds dirty. Enlightened sounds too shallow.
Yeah.
Well, but rather, tell us what it is and why you think I was experiencing what I was.
Well, I think it's in part because we've not been allowed to kind of open our minds and open our hearts to this kind of tragic history. And
tragic history of what?
Tragic history of lynching, tragic history of racial inequality. The first thing you encounter in the memorial is a sculpture of 7 enslaved people in chains. And despite the legacy of slavery in this country, none of us have been required to see that. And we wanted to create a sculpture about slavery that presented the brutality of slavery, but also the humanity of the enslaved, because that shows us something about the human spirit, the human capacity. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia. And he learned to read despite the fact that he was enslaved because he had this hope that one day he'd be free. And that quest for freedom is something we all identify with. And you go through the memorial and you enter the first column and you see these 6-foot monuments with names and you realize that these are people who were lynched, who were tortured, who were killed by mobs. And then as you get
no trial, no nothing. I mean, this is epitome of injustice.
That's exactly.
I'm afraid of you. I think you did something I don't like. So immediate justice for you right now, we're going to string you up.
People were killed, black people were killed because they didn't call a white person sir, because they didn't get off the sidewalk, because they knocked on the front door rather than the back door, because they sent a note to someone, because they smiled when they weren't supposed to smile. It was social transgressions as well as accusations of crime, and it was traumatizing to the entire African American community. And we constructed the memorial so that when you get to the second corridor, you see the monuments begin to rise. And in the third corridor, you're standing underneath these pillars, these monuments that represent all of this violence. And it's important for me that people understand what it's like to live under that kind of violence. You know, they could have buried all the bodies of the lynching victims, but they lifted them up because they wanted to torture and terrorize and taunt other people of color, to intimidate. And then you come out of that, and then you read the words, and we do have words in there. And I talk about how we have to have a hope that we can commit to never doing this again. I am persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. I really think that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And when we make that commitment, things get lifted up, and you come out and then you see the sculptures about the civil rights era, because that's where the courageous black women who stayed off the bus for a year pushed this country to do better. And then you see a monument about the police violence and the issues that we still face today. And so I hope it's a place where people are awakened and then energized and then determined to commit to something that gets us to a better place. That's the point of that memorial. And, you know, yes, it's challenging, but I just have never seen justice prevail. I've never seen liberty win. I've never seen equality triumph if we aren't challenged to do the things that must be done.
Your life work is really remarkable, but even underneath that, I'm just curious about your life. Do you have like certain rules for life you follow? I mean, or like something you learned that dictates what you do? Like I like to say, I want to make aggressive mistakes. I want to do things that are aggressive, and that does cause me to make mistakes, but it caused me to be pushing. There's got to be some credo, some constitution, someone drilled into you for you to keep doing these things that are out of the norm, impactful, and they're working. What is there? Come on, there's got to be. Give us something here. Help us out.
Well, I do think that you have to be prepared to kind of think critically about what you're doing. And if there's a better way to do it, if there's a better way to achieve the things that need to be achieved, you have to be prepared to make changes. I started out as a lawyer who only represented people on death row. And over time, I began to realize that the problems in those cases were actually getting harder to solve if we just did those cases. So we broadened the mandate. And then we started representing children. And then we started representing the mentally ill. And then we started representing people in other states. And you just have to be willing to do things that are different if they're going to get you closer to where you need to go. I never imagined 10 years ago I'd build a museum and a memorial. I would have said, that's crazy. Why would I do that? And then I began to realize that there is an absence of cultural spaces that push us, that encourage us to think more deeply about these issues. And I couldn't just wait for somebody else. We had to do it. And even writing a book and having a movie made, I was very resistant to having a film made based on my book, because I see a lot of movies after I've read books and I'm sort of disappointed, and I didn't want that to happen. But I was persuaded that if we want to reach people where they are, if we want to get to people who are not going to pick up the book, we have to have the courage, we have to have the heart to do things that are a little uncomfortable. And it was a bit uncomfortable for me. But I've been really blessed to see the affirmation. It doesn't always work. We don't always make the right decision. But if you have the courage to reflect honestly about what you've done and then make changes, I hope, you know, there's never a certain thing that someone says, oh, he only does that, he only does that, he only does that. I don't want to be that kind of person. I want to be the person who does what I'm called to do. I want to be the person who does the things that are necessary to create justice.
So no master plan, no Excel spreadsheet you're working on. You see something and I need to do that. You see that and I need to do that. You push.
You push. You have to be strategic. You have to be tactical. You have to think about, okay, well, how do we get where we're trying to go? I look at where we are and how do we get there? But we have donors that say, well, tell us exactly what you're going to do over the next 5 years. I said, well, we have a plan, but we're going to do the things that have to be done. If things change, when we see an insurrection at the Capitol, that means we got to think more critically about what's happening in the hearts and minds of people in this country. You see a lot of unarmed shootings of unarmed Black people. You got to deal with that. You know, you see a lot of violence manifesting itself in our jails and prisons. You have to be responsive to that. And I just think that's the way, I think that kind of openness to change is going to really be important.